I didn't mean to remember it in color, but I do. His hands warm and steady on my stomach, the granite counter cool under my skin, my breath caught somewhere between guilt and something that felt much worse because it didn't feel wrong at all, just inevitable. Tyler was behind me, his chest brushing my back like he didn't care how close he was anymore, his lips close enough that every word pulsed against my ear, and when he whispered, "You knew I wasn't going to leave, didn't you?" I didn't answer because I couldn't pretend I hadn't been waiting for him to say something just like that. When the light changed in the kitchen, and I caught our reflection in the microwave's glossy door, I saw a woman I didn't quite recognize and a man who looked far too calm to be standing where he was, and for a moment I just watched us like we were strangers in someone else's house. Then the sound of a suitcase being zipped up snapped me back to Friday morning, to the moment my daughter came barreling down the stairs with her college bag bouncing behind her like it had its own momentum, her voice bright and careless as she called for Tyler to hurry or she'd miss her ride to the bus stop. Emily was all energy and joy, hugging me with arms that didn't know how far they'd be stretched by the end of the semester, and I held her longer than I meant to because something in me already knew that when she let go, I would feel the space she left behind in ways I hadn't prepared for. Tyler jogged down with her duffel slung over one shoulder, kissed her quickly without ceremony, and looked over her head directly at me with an expression that didn't match the moment, his eyes unreadable but fixed, his smirk pulling just slightly at the corner like he knew something I didn't. Emily laughed and tossed a line over her shoulder, saying, "Don't let Mom get too lonely, okay?" And Tyler, without missing a beat, replied, "I'll take good care of her." And although Emily was already turning toward the gate, that pause, just a beat too long, settled on me like a shadow, and I caught myself frozen, unable to decide whether to laugh it off or wonder why it didn't feel like a joke. That night, when the house was finally quiet and her perfume had faded from the hallway, I sat in the living room in an old set of pajamas I hadn't worn in years, the cotton soft and stretched at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to my elbows. Tyler was already there, one leg hooked over the other, holding a glass of red wine like he'd lived here forever. A black and white movie flickering across the TV that I recognized immediately because Daniel used to mock me for liking it, saying it was too slow and too sad, like life wasn't already full of both. I sat on the other end of the couch with a space between us that should have felt safer than it did, but after a few minutes our legs brushed once and then again, and neither of us moved away because pretending it hadn't happened took less effort than pretending it didn't matter. At one point I said something about the wine being too sweet, and he offered me his glass without thinking, and I took it because saying no would have made it feel like a boundary we hadn't admitted to crossing. Later, after the movie ended and we started cleaning up, he followed me into the kitchen and we worked side by side without speaking, and when we both reached for the same plate, our hands met and stayed there just long enough for something to stir deep in my chest. I looked up at him, and he didn't flinch or smile or look away, and for a moment the whole world narrowed to just the sound of the faucet and the weight of his eyes holding mine in place. I smiled instinctively, as if I could soften the moment, by pretending it didn't shake me, but my heart thudded so hard I thought he might hear it. Daniel called just after 10. His voice was flat and tired, the kind of tone people use when their mind's still somewhere else. He asked if I'd paid the insurance and reminded me to water the plants, and when I told him Emily had left on time, he just said, "Good." And then there was a pause, the kind that used to mean he was about to say he missed me, but this time it was just empty, and I waited longer than I should have before hanging up because some small part of me hoped he'd remember to ask how. Hours passed and I couldn't sleep. I tossed the covers back and forth, the sheets too cold and the air too still, until I gave up and padded down the hallway to get a glass of water. The light in the kitchen was already on. Tyler was standing by the fridge, barefoot, shirtless, drinking straight from the bottle like he belonged in this space. He turned when I walked in but didn't apologize or step aside. I reached past him for a glass and felt his breath more than I heard him breathe, and for a second I couldn't remember why I'd come in at all. He didn't say anything, neither did I. And yet, when I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of us, reflected in the microwave door, the tilt of my head, the stillness of his mouth, the way he looked at me like nothing about this was accidental. And I noticed the way he bit his lip, slow and deliberate, like he didn't care if I saw. I didn't speak, I didn't move, and I didn't leave right away. Not because I was paralyzed or unsure, but because some things, once opened, can't be closed again. I turned off the kitchen light, not because I was ready to go, but because the brightness made everything too visible, too real, and I didn't want to see myself reflected in all the shiny surfaces of a room that had suddenly started feeling like someone else's house. I walked back to the hallway, trying not to think about how the floor creaked under my feet or how I knew Tyler was still standing behind me even after I left the room. I stopped at the foot of the stairs, glanced back once, caught his outline through the shadows, and still I didn't say a word. Upstairs, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the spot Daniel usually filled when he wasn't traveling, which had become more and more often lately, as if he'd realized there were fewer arguments on the road. I didn't pull the covers over me, didn't check my phone, didn't even wash the glass I had taken upstairs. I just sat there for what felt like hours, letting silence settle around me like dust that had no intention of being wiped away. In the morning, I moved through the house slowly, not because I was tired, but because every step I took felt like I was tiptoeing through something fragile, as though if I moved too fast I might trigger a memory I wasn't ready to admit had formed. I made coffee and stared through the window above the sink, watched Tyler walk across the backyard barefoot, his shirt now on, damp at the collar, his hand running through his hair like he was trying to shake off sleep. But when he looked up and saw me watching, he didn't look away, didn't wave, didn't even smile. He just held my gaze for a few seconds longer than any version of normal could explain. We didn't talk about the night before, didn't reference the reflection, the silence, the closeness, or the way I had paused longer than any woman should have. Instead, he asked if I wanted toast, and I nodded like that made sense, like breakfast could scrub away what had already taken root. Later that afternoon, while I folded laundry that smelled like detergent and familiarity, Tyler walked into the living room and started talking about how the front cabinet door kept sticking, how it was probably just the hinges needing oil. He didn't wait for permission, just grabbed a screwdriver and got on one knee like he'd always belonged to this house. I stood in the doorway pretending to check something on my phone, but I watched him work, forearms tense, jaw set, t-shirt riding slightly up his back as he leaned forward. He was younger than I remembered, stronger. I realized I didn't know when I'd last really looked at him as anything more than Emily's friend, Daniel's son by another marriage, the boy who always offered to carry the heavy groceries. The sun pushed through the kitchen window like it had something to prove, making everything look golden and too soft. When he stood up and stretched, his shirt stuck slightly to his back, and for a moment I couldn't stop my eyes from following the line of his body. He turned around, caught my stare, and raised an eyebrow like a question had been asked. I laughed, nervous and too high, and said something about needing to vacuum upstairs, but we both knew it wasn't about the carpet. That evening, I changed into my older pajamas again, the loose cotton ones with sleeves that slid down too easily, and came downstairs to find Tyler already on the couch, this time with a different wine, a deeper red, and an older film I hadn't seen in years. He made room beside him, not with words, but with the way he shifted the blanket off the cushion and draped it across the armrest like an invitation. I sat. Our legs touched again. It felt too natural, too easy. When he passed me the glass, our fingers touched, and I didn't move away. We drank in silence. The movie played. Outside, a dog barked in the neighbor's yard. Somewhere down the street, a sprinkler started, spraying rhythmic bursts into the air like clockwork. He turned to me at one point and said, "You used to like this one, right?" I nodded, surprised he remembered, or that I had ever mentioned it. "Yeah," I said. "It used to be my favorite." "I know," he replied, not bragging, not pressing, just confirming. And that was it. That was the moment I realized we were already speaking in a code only we understood, that there was something unspoken between us. Neither of us was willing to name out loud yet, but it was there. The rest of the night blurred quietly. He helped dry the glasses after dinner. Our hands brushed again. This time I didn't pull away. He didn't either. When Daniel called again, I almost didn't pick up. But I did. His voice was distant, tired. He asked about the house, the lawn, the water bill. I said everything was fine. He said he'd be home next week, maybe if the meetings didn't run late. I said okay. We hung up without saying goodnight. After midnight, I heard Tyler's footsteps, in the hallway again. This time I didn't hesitate. I got up, stepped into the dim light of the kitchen just as he opened the fridge. We didn't speak, and in the reflection of the microwave, I saw myself standing there, eyes wide, breath held. I saw him behind me, bare feet on tile, hair tousled from sleep or something worse. And when he looked at me and bit down on his lower lip, slow and deliberate, I knew we were past the point of wondering. I didn't walk away. The morning came slow and heavy, like it knew something I didn't. And when I made my way into the kitchen, hair still damp from the pillow and my robe, slipping off one shoulder, I heard the sound of metal against wood, steady and deliberate. Tyler was crouched in front of the lower cabinets with a screwdriver in one hand and the other bracing himself against the floor, shirtless again, as if clothes were optional now that Emily was gone, and Daniel was nothing more than a voice through a phone. The muscles in his back moved like they had their own rhythm, his jeans riding low enough to make me shift my gaze without meaning to, but my eyes didn't listen to the voice in my head telling them to stop. He looked over his shoulder, caught me staring, and grinned like he was used to it. Like this wasn't the first time a woman had paused in a doorway pretending to care about what he was fixing, when she was really just watching the way his shoulder blades moved beneath his skin. He said, "You sure your husband doesn't want to come back and fix this himself?" With that drawl he used when he was teasing but also testing, and before I could stop myself, I answered with a laugh that sounded more bitter than amused. He rarely fixes anything anymore, which came out too fast and too sharp, and I hated how true it felt the second I heard it spoken aloud. He stood slowly, wiped his hands on a towel without taking his eyes off me, and I realized I hadn't moved since I walked in. I made some excuse about needing coffee and turned to the counter, my fingers fumbling with the buttons on the machine like I'd forgotten how it worked, but I could feel him behind me, still watching, still waiting for something I wasn't ready to admit I wanted. Later that day, while I vacuumed the stairs and he wiped down the hallway mirror, we kept running into each other like the house had suddenly shrunk. When I bent down to plug in the vacuum, he walked past and his hand brushed against my shoulder, not hard, not accidental, just intentional. He didn't pull away immediately, just let it rest there for a second longer than he should have, and when I glanced back, he didn't say sorry, didn't move his hand, just smiled and said, "You're warm." Like that explained everything. I stepped aside, said nothing, but the smile that slipped across my face betrayed me before I could stop it. We had lunch on the back porch, the air thick with humidity and the smell of cut grass from the neighbor's yard drifting across the fence. And Tyler talked more than usual, told me about his mom, how she left when he was 10 and didn't call, until he was 16, how his dad remarried too fast and expected him to fall in love with people he didn't even like, how holidays felt like auditions for some kind of family he never got picked for. I didn't expect him to be so open, so raw, and somewhere between stories about birthday parties with empty chairs and how he learned to make his own dinner by the time he was 12, I stopped chewing and just listened. He said, "Sometimes I think all I really want is a real family, you know? Like, not perfect, just something that feels like it won't leave." And for a moment, I didn't know if he was talking to me or just thinking out loud. But either way, it hit me harder than I wanted it to. I nodded, murmured something vague about how people don't always know what they have until it's gone, and he looked at me like he already knew I wasn't talking about him. That evening, I was folding towels in the laundry room when music started playing from the living room, not loud, just the kind of lazy, old-school rhythm that reminded me of beach drives and open windows. I walked in and saw him swaying slightly by the speakers, eyes closed, humming along. I laughed, asked if he was practicing for a wedding, and he opened. His eyes reached out a hand and said, "Dance with me." At first I refused, half laughing, but he stepped forward and took both my hands like we'd done this before, and before I could pull away, we were turning slowly in the center of the room. It wasn't formal or even real dancing, just weight, shifting, arms moving, laughter caught in the back of my throat. But somewhere in that moment, something shifted. His grip tightened just slightly, and I leaned in just enough that I could smell his skin and something like cedar wood and sweat. My hand slid up to his shoulder without thinking, and when our eyes met, I forgot the rules I was supposed to be following. I pulled away fast, heart racing, voice shaking as I said, "We shouldn't do this," trying to sound firm, trying to sound like I meant it. But he didn't chase or argue, just nodded once and said, "But you feel it too," and walked back to the couch like the matter had already been settled. That night, long after he went upstairs, and the house fell silent, again, I opened an old photo album I hadn't touched in years, the one Emily made for me on my birthday with pictures from every summer trip and school play. I flipped through it slowly, page by page, until I reached a photo I barely remembered taking. The three of us standing in the garden, Emily smiling bright and proud, Tyler beside her with his arm around her shoulder. But what stopped me wasn't their smiles. It was the way he was looking at me, not at Emily, at me. I closed the album slowly, like it might shatter if I moved too fast, the weight of that single photo pressing harder than all the others combined, because once you see something like that, once you notice what someone tried not to show, you can't pretend you didn't. I sat on the edge of the bed with it in my lap, the room lit only by the soft yellow lamp on the dresser, the silence so full I could hear my own pulse in my ears. That look, it hadn't been a glance or a mistake or some fluke of lighting. It had been clear and direct and entirely mine, and what scared me wasn't the look itself but the fact that I hadn't seen it until now. I left the bedroom without knowing why, the floor cool beneath my feet, the hallway dim and quiet except for the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I didn't turn on any lights. I didn't need them. I knew the layout of this house better than I knew my own thoughts lately. I walked to the bathroom, turned on the water in the shower, and let the steam start to build while I leaned against the sink, watching my reflection fog and soften in the mirror like it was ashamed of me. The robe slipped off my shoulders as I stepped inside the glass enclosure, the hot stream hitting my skin like confession. I closed my eyes, tilted my head back, tried to pretend the heat could burn away the memory of that dance, of those words, of his hand resting too comfortably against my lower back. But the more I tried to forget, the more my body remembered. Then, I felt it. That sensation that prickles along your neck when you know someone's eyes are on you, when something shifts in the air just enough to make you doubt whether you're truly alone. I opened my eyes and turned toward the door. It was open, not wide, just enough. He was there. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there in the dim hallway light, half in shadow, half outlined by the glow from the bathroom. His eyes didn't wander, didn't leer, but they didn't look away either. My hands froze mid-motion, water dripping from my elbows, steam curling around my face like a veil I couldn't hide behind. We stared at each other in silence, a silence thicker than the steam, heavier than guilt. I didn't scream. I didn't cover myself. I didn't even ask him to leave. I just stood there, heart hammering, breath shallow, waiting for something, anything, to break the moment. But nothing did. He didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. He simply watched, and I understood something right then that I'd been pretending not to see. There were no blurred lines anymore. There was no room left for maybes or almosts. This wasn't a boy playing pretend. This was a man who had decided what he wanted, and for reasons I couldn't admit even to myself, I hadn't stopped him. I reached for the handle and turned off the water, the sudden silence ringing in my ears louder than the spray ever had. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty. He was gone, but the air still felt thick with him. I wrapped the towel around me slowly, moving like I was in someone else's skin, and walked back to my room without turning my head toward the other door across the hall. His door. I closed mine. Behind me and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, towel clutched tight around my chest like it might hold something in place if I squeezed hard enough. The light from the hallway slipped under the door, stretching thin across the carpet, and I watched it for what felt like hours, waiting for a shadow to pass by, for footsteps, for anything to signal that this thing between us still lived on, the other side of that wall. But nothing came, and maybe that was the loudest thing of all. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the sheets clinging to damp skin, my mind tracing every moment from that day like pieces of a puzzle I never meant to solve. The dance, the touch, the way he'd looked at me while fixing the cabinet like he knew exactly what was coming. And the truth was, I had let it come. I had let every moment stretch a little too long. Every look land a little too deep. Every silence fill a little too much space. And now the question I couldn't stop asking myself wasn't how we got here. It was how far I would let it go, because the line had been crossed the second I didn't close the bathroom door, and part of me, a part I barely recognized anymore, didn't regret it. I should have knocked, or at least hesitated at the doorway, but something pulled me forward like I wasn't walking under my own will anymore. Like my hand was on the doorknob because it had been waiting for this moment longer than I'd let myself admit. And when I pushed it open, I didn't expect him to be there, not lying on the edge of my bed with his hands folded behind his head, like he had every right to be in that space, in that room, at that hour. He didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't even pretend to be surprised. He just looked at me, calm and sure, his voice low and steady when he said, "I knew you'd come," and the way he said it didn't sound arrogant. It sounded true. I stood there frozen, fingers still wrapped around the handle, bare feet sinking into the carpet, heartbeat thudding somewhere deep in my stomach. And before I could decide what to say or how to back away without tripping over my own guilt, he got up slowly, as if he knew any sudden movement might make me run. He didn't speak again. He just stepped forward and lifted his hand, the back of his fingers brushing softly against my cheek, his touch light but deliberate. And in that moment, something inside me splintered. Not because I didn't expect it, but because I had. I whispered, "We can't," the words slipping out too fast, too hollow, too weak to stand on their own. And he didn't challenge them, didn't push back with logic or desire or excuses. He just leaned in slightly, his breath warm and slow against my temple, and said, "We already are," with the kind of calm that only makes sense when everything's already gone too far to undo. He kissed me like it wasn't the first time in his mind, like he had imagined it often enough to know exactly how long to linger before moving, exactly how close to stay without making me run, and I didn't stop him, didn't turn my head, didn't remind him who I was supposed to be or what lines we were standing on either side of, because all of that felt distant and muffled under the weight of this new truth pressing gently but firmly against my mouth. At first it was cautious, as if he was still waiting for me to say no, but when I didn't pull back, when I leaned into it just slightly, when I let my fingers graze the front of his shirt, when I opened my mouth without thinking, he deepened the kiss with a slowness that didn't ask permission because it already knew the answer. My hands moved to his chest, not to push him away, but to hold him there, to anchor myself in a moment I already knew I'd regret but couldn't stop chasing. And then my phone rang, that sharp, sudden tone slicing through the haze like a spotlight in the dark, and I gasped, pulling back fast, breathless and shaking, eyes wide with panic as I turned toward the nightstand. I grabbed the phone with trembling hands and saw Emily's name flashing on the screen, her smiling face frozen in mid-laugh on the video preview, and for a second I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't believe the timing. Tyler was still inches from me, watching, waiting, his chest rising and falling like he hadn't caught his breath yet either, and I answered the call with a swipe that felt like peeling away skin. Emily's voice burst into the room, cheerful and unsuspecting, her background all blurry trees and dorm lights. "Mom," she said, smiling, "Tyler texted me earlier, said you cooked something amazing again. That pasta, right? I swear he always brags about your cooking like you're a 5-star chef." My stomach dropped. I nodded, forcing a smile that barely held together. "Yeah, well, it was just leftovers," I said, voice higher than usual, brittle at the edges, trying not to glance toward Tyler, who hadn't moved, who was still standing exactly where he'd been when our lips separated. Emily kept talking, some story about a roommate and bad cafeteria food, her laughter sweet and sharp like glass in my ears, and all I could think about was the way he was watching me, unashamed, unhurried, like nothing about this needed to be hidden. She ended the call with a quick, "Love you," and a wave, and the second the screen went dark, the silence between us collapsed back into something dense and heavy and impossible to ignore. I didn't speak. I didn't know what to say that didn't sound ridiculous or false or too late. I just sat there with the phone still in my hand and the ghost of his mouth still on mine. He didn't move closer, not right away. He just leaned against the wall with arms crossed, voice soft, and even when he said, "I've wanted this since I first met you," and it didn't sound like a confession. It sounded like a fact. I didn't answer him because anything I might have said would have come out either too loud or not loud enough, too guilty or too desperate, and neither option could change the truth. We had both just lived in real time, one breath at a time, one impossible second layered on top of another. I sat on the edge of the bed, still clutching the phone like it might ring again and save me from having to make a choice, but the screen stayed black, and the air around us stayed thick, and I knew, without doubt and without delay, that silence wasn't going to erase what had just happened. He pushed himself away from the wall, like the weight of his words had finally cleared the space between us, his expression unreadable but steady, his steps quiet as he crossed the room again, not rushing, not hesitating, and I watched him the way someone watches a storm they know is going to hit but can't bring themselves to shut the windows against. He didn't touch me this time. He didn't have to. Everything about him said enough. I stood slowly, unsure whether I was moving toward him or away from myself, and when our eyes met, something shifted again. Not wild or desperate like the first kiss, but slow and sure like we were stepping into a version of the world that had been waiting behind a locked door. We finally had the nerve to open. He lifted his hand to my face again, not with the urgency of temptation, but with the softness of someone who already knew I wouldn't turn away. The kiss that followed didn't ask for permission and didn't need to, because whatever I had been telling myself for the last few weeks had already unraveled the moment our lips had touched the first time. This time there was no pause, no pull back, no question hanging in the air. I kissed him like I meant it, like I had meant it long before I ever let myself think it. And I let myself lean into the weight of his body and the heat of his breath, and the way his hands held my waist like I was something familiar and sacred at the same time. His mouth moved against mine with a rhythm that didn't rush, didn't beg, just claimed, and when his hand slid to the back of my neck, thumb grazing, my jaw, I melted into the pull of him like it was always going to be this way, like there had never really been another ending. I felt my body press against his, my fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt. And for a moment, I forgot what floor we were on or what room we were in or who I was supposed to be when the lights came back on. We broke apart only because we needed air, not distance. And when I looked at him, really looked, I didn't see a mistake or a stranger or a child. I saw a man who had seen something in me before I remembered it existed. I stepped back first, only because I had to breathe. And he didn't chase or question, just nodded slowly like he understood that this wasn't a retreat. It was a pause. The next day passed in fragments. Quiet spaces filled with movement and avoidance and long looks that said too much. I folded laundry I didn't remember washing, walked to the mailbox and stood there without opening it, made coffee twice and drank neither cup. He didn't push, didn't speak first, didn't repeat the night in words or gestures, but I could feel him in every room I entered, like his presence had seeped into the walls. That evening, I stayed in the kitchen longer than usual, pretending to reorganize the spice rack, my hands trembling slightly when I reached for the oregano just to do something with my fingers. Behind me, the floor creaked, only once, and I didn't turn around. I felt him before I saw him, heard the way he stopped just short of touching me, and then his voice, low and steady, cut through the air like it had been waiting all day for the right moment to find me. I wasn't going to let it end there, he said, not with demand or threat, but with certainty. And when I finally turned to face him, I didn't argue. I stepped toward him before I could think, closed the space between us without words, and kissed him again. Not because I was weak, or lost or confused, but because I wasn't anymore. I kissed him because I wanted to, because the lie I'd been trying to live in had finally dissolved beneath the heat of something too real to ignore. His hands found my shoulders, then my waist, then the curve of my back, pulling me gently into him like he had memorized every part of the space I occupied. The kiss lasted longer this time, deeper, heavier, like both of us had already given up pretending this was an accident or a mistake. I felt him breathing through his nose, steadying himself like I was both temptation and anchor. I felt the tension melt from my shoulders as my fingers curled into his shirt, and I didn't flinch when his lips moved to my neck again, soft and warm and full of quiet need. And then the lightning struck outside, not close but bright enough, to flood the room with a sharp white flash, the kind that rearranges shadows and makes you remember where you are. I opened my eyes and saw us reflected in the oven glass, two silhouettes entangled in a scene that couldn't be undone. I didn't move. I didn't release him. I only whispered, almost without breath, "Don't leave tonight." And he answered, by staying. He didn't speak. He didn't nod. He just kissed me again, softer this time, like sealing a promise neither of us dared put into words. Outside, the thunder rolled in, low and patient. Inside, we didn't sleep. The days began dissolving into each other with a quiet, relentless rhythm, as if time itself had stopped keeping track and started dragging instead, and I found myself waking at odd hours in the same clothes I had fallen asleep in, unsure whether I had dreamed or merely endured another stretch of darkness interrupted only by the shifting sounds of footsteps in the hallway or the clink of dishes in the sink I didn't remember using, and more I caught myself standing, still in doorways or hallways or the corner of the kitchen, watching Tyler move through the house with the ease of someone who no longer felt like a visitor, but like a presence that had rooted itself into the walls and furniture, not by force, but by slow and silent absorption. I stopped answering Daniel's calls not because I had something to hide, but because the sound of his voice, polite, flat, concerned in a distant, managerial way, made something inside me flinch, with a guilt I couldn't explain and didn't want to hold up against the reality of what my days had become. Days spent hovering around the edges of moments I didn't know how to stop and didn't dare name, and nights spent lying awake or pacing the hallway outside Emily's room, the door always slightly ajar now, the scent of Tyler's cologne bleeding into the fabric of her sheets, his chest bare beneath the light blanket, his arms stretched across her pillow with the kind of comfort that should have felt wrong, but instead pulled at something raw and wordless inside me. The toothbrush he used stood next to mine like it had always been there. His towel hung over the bathroom door in a familiar slouch, and every morning he walked into the kitchen still damp from his shower, the towel wrapped low around his waist, the mug I always used resting casually in his hand, and without fail, without words, he leaned in to kiss my neck near the coffee machine. His lips never rushed, his breath warm, his presence unshakable, and I let it happen because trying to stop it felt like trying to stop the tide. We drove to the store that morning like we had always done it, like the world had given us permission to exist this way. And in the cereal aisle, he leaned in close, reading off boxes and ingredients over my shoulder with the kind of casual intimacy that belonged to another kind of relationship. And when his hand brushed mine reaching for a box of granola I didn't step away right away. And in the frozen aisle, he smiled when I reached for mint chocolate chip, said he remembered I liked that one, then dropped 2 pints into the cart like it was a perfectly ordinary gesture, like every moment before hadn't already tilted the axis of my whole life. It was near the deli counter, the smell of sliced ham and plastic gloves and citrus cleaner thick in the air, that he reached for my hand and interlaced his fingers with mine, not timidly or testing, but like someone staking quiet claim, and I froze for a second, then yanked my hand back with the force of someone trying to erase a second of truth, and when I looked up, expecting hurt or confusion or embarrassment, I found only sharpness in his eyes and stillness in his voice when he said, "Don't pretend now." And I felt that phrase settle somewhere between my throat and stomach, cold and permanent and true. In the parking lot, I couldn't hold it together, not even for show, and I collapsed against the steering wheel in our parked car with tears sliding down my face in the kind of silence that doesn't feel like relief but punishment. Every breath caught, every muscle tight, and he sat in the passenger seat watching the front windshield like none of it surprised him, his voice a whisper of certainty when I finally managed to choke out, "This isn't who I am." And he said, without pity or triumph, just steady and unblinking, "Maybe it is." And I wanted to scream but couldn't find the air. That night, the sky turned an unsettling gray long before sunset, the clouds thick and low, and I sat on the living room couch wrapped in an old cardigan I didn't remember pulling from the closet. My legs tucked under me, the TV off, the room lit only by the soft yellow of the floor lamp and the occasional flash of headlights through the blinds. And I stared at nothing in particular until my phone buzzed against the glass coffee table. And I picked it up with the weight of 1,000 imagined outcomes only to find one simple message that cracked something open inside my chest. Emily's text read, "I'll be home tomorrow, early." And I reread it 3 times, each time. Slower, each time more breathless. And I didn't respond, couldn't respond, because nothing I could type would slow the clock now or undo what had been done. And when Tyler walked into the room, barefoot, calm, silent, I didn't even try to hide the screen before locking it, and I told him flatly, "She's coming. Home." And he didn't flinch or frown or ask questions. He just stood there like the ground hadn't shifted at all and said, "Let her come." I stood abruptly, the movement too fast, my balance almost failing, and I said it louder than I meant to, "You have to go." The words empty even as they left my mouth, and he stepped forward, not in defiance but in quiet challenge, and said, "Not until you say you don't want me." And in that moment the room shrank, the air thickened, and the truth between us became a third presence neither of us could walk around anymore. Because the truth was, I couldn't say it. I didn't. Speak again. I didn't argue or cry or demand anything. I just turned and left the room with shaking fingers and a heartbeat that made my ears ring, and I locked myself in the bathroom and stared at my reflection in the mirror, not because I wanted to see myself, but because I needed proof I still existed outside of him. And with my fingers trembling, I picked up the phone and called Daniel, my husband, the man I'd stopped recognizing in photos and phone calls and memory. And when he answered with a groggy but alert, "What happened?" I realized I couldn't even tell him what I had done. So I said, "Come home." And when the silence grew between us, I hung up before I heard what came next. The rest of the evening passed in a kind of slow-motion haze, where every sound felt either too sharp or too distant, and I moved through the house like someone walking underwater, my limbs heavy with dread and my mind spinning in quiet circles I couldn't break. And though I tried to keep myself busy, wiping already clean, counters, folding towels that hadn't been used, refilling a water pitcher no one had emptied, it was as if my body knew distraction was useless now. Because no matter how long I stayed on my feet, eventually I'd have to lie down in a bed that no longer felt like mine, in a room that still smelled faintly of someone I didn't want to admit I had invited in again and again, not just with glances or touches, but with silence, with space, with the absence of resistance. I thought about texting Emily again. Just a short message, maybe something casual and cheerful like, "Can't wait to see you," or "Drive safe, sweetheart." But every time I lifted the phone and unlocked the screen, I saw the last thing she'd written, the quiet certainty of her return, and I knew no amount of cheerful punctuation or exclamation marks could soften the blow of what she was about to walk into, because I hadn't cleaned anything up, hadn't undone any of it, and more than that, I hadn't really wanted to. Tyler didn't speak much that night, didn't touch me, didn't offer comfort or conversation, just moved through the same spaces I did with the same stillness that had begun to define him in this house. His presence no longer loud or urgent, but firm, embedded, as though he'd figured out exactly how much to say and when to say it. And the truth was, he didn't need to say anything anymore, because every breath, every step, every pause near a doorway where I stood pretending not to notice, said more than I could bear to hear aloud. I tried to sleep, tried to slow my breath and keep my eyes closed long enough to fall out of this loop of what ifs and when did it starts. But the ticking of the clock on the dresser sounded like a countdown, and every time I turned over I expected to see someone, watching from the dark, though the only thing that looked back at me was the faint outline of myself in the bedroom mirror, curled in on one side, like a woman trying to disappear into the smallest version of herself she could still carry. Around midnight I got up and walked barefoot to the bathroom again, locking the door behind me with fingers that didn't feel entirely mine, and I sat on the edge of the tub for what might have been 30 minutes or 3 hours, staring at the tile grout between my feet and thinking about how many nights I had wasted worrying about things that didn't matter. Daniel's tone in text messages, Emily's missed curfews, the electric bill that always came late, and how none of that seemed real now compared to the simple, unbearable fact that I had broken something I could never fix. I wanted to call someone, anyone, maybe my sister or the woman at work who used to ask how I was doing, without expecting me to say fine. But I didn't, because what would I say? That I let my stepdaughter's boyfriend sleep in her bed and drink from my mug and wrap his arms around me like I belonged to him. That I hadn't just allowed it, but had craved it in a way I hadn't craved anything in years. Not affection, not comfort, not even escape. But this dangerous, steady sense of being seen. I splashed water on my face, dried it without looking up, and walked back down the hallway with the same mechanical stillness I had begun to wear like armor, each step soft, each breath shallow. And when I reached my bedroom door, I paused, just for a second, hand hovering over the knob, afraid of what might be behind it, and more afraid of what might not. I pushed it open. The room was dark except for the faint blue glow of the charger light on my nightstand, and the bed looked untouched even though I knew I had been in it, had tried to make it familiar again, had tried to convince myself that tomorrow I would find the words to end this, all of it, before it reached her, before Emily saw it with her own eyes instead of hearing it through the cracks. And then I heard the sound. Not loud, not rushed, just slow, steady footsteps. Tyler appeared in the doorway not like a shadow, not like an intruder, but like someone returning to a place he'd already claimed. His body relaxed, his hair tousled, his face unreadable in the dim light. And he didn't step forward, didn't raise his voice, didn't even ask if I was awake. He just stood there, the weight of the house settling between us like a final breath. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, but every word dropped. Like stone into water. Let her come, he said, his eyes fixed on mine, his mouth steady. You're mine already. And the worst part was, I didn't deny it. I didn't say a word. I didn't move. I just lay there, still and silent, as the storm outside began to tap against the windows with long, patient fingers, and the girl I had once been, the wife, the mother, the woman who folded laundry and planned meals and signed school forms, slipped a little further from reach. The door slammed shut with a sound that didn't just echo down the hallway, but seemed to stop every breath in the house, and in the seconds that followed, the only movement I felt was the rush of blood pounding in my ears and the sudden hollow silence that replaced all the excuses I hadn't had time to prepare. And when I turned, still clutching the loose belt of the robe I hadn't tied properly, I saw her standing at the end of the hallway with her suitcase at her side and her hand still on the doorknob like she wasn't sure whether to step forward or walk right back out. And in that pause, in that thick silence where no one said a word, I saw the moment she understood everything. She didn't scream or cry or drop her bag in dramatic disbelief. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her eyes moving from my face to the open neckline of my robe, then to the shadow that shifted just behind me as Tyler stepped away slowly, not hiding, not apologizing, not even startled. And when he moved out from behind me into full view, shirtless, barefoot, hair still. Damp from the shower, she took a long breath like she had been preparing herself for this exact moment for longer than I could imagine. How long? She asked, and though her voice didn't shake, I heard something break underneath it, not with noise but with weight. And I opened my mouth once, then again, but nothing came out. No words, no explanations, no shallow defenses, and before I could find anything that might have softened what she already knew, Tyler walked past her without looking back and climbed the stairs, each step deliberate, steady, slow, like he had no part left to play in what was about to happen. I stood there frozen for a moment longer, still gripping the edge of the robe that now felt unbearably thin, my back exposed, my hair sticking to the side of my neck with sweat I hadn't noticed until just now. And I watched her back as she finally picked up her suitcase again, walked past me without a word, and disappeared into her room. The same room he had been sleeping in for the past week, the same room I had stopped knocking on before opening, the same room where I had undone years of motherhood in the span of a few nights. I hadn't known how to stop. It was barely half an hour later when I heard the car outside, the tires crunching against the gravel driveway, the slam of a door, the quick, heavy steps that didn't belong to Emily, and when I opened the front door, I was met with the sight of Daniel, jaw tight, eyes scanning me like a crime scene, phone still in his hand, breath shallow like he had run up the walkway instead of walked. And without even saying hello or asking where she was, he pushed past me into the hallway, calling out, "Emily!" in that voice he always used when something had gone wrong, and he expected me to be the one to fix it. She came out quickly, no tears, no dramatic gestures, just a short nod, a quick, "I told him everything." And then she stepped aside, arms crossed, eyes locked on the floor like she couldn't bear to look at either of us anymore. And when Daniel turned toward me, the fury on his face wasn't wild or loud. It was focused, razor sharp, steady, and when he said, "You let my daughter walk into this?" It wasn't a question. It was a sentence, one I had no chance to reduce. I tried to explain, tried to find some version of the truth that would sound less vile out loud, stumbled through half-formed phrases like, "I didn't plan this," and "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," and "It's not what it looks like," even though it was exactly what it looked like. And when I finally said, "I was under pressure, I was confused, he kept showing up, there was emotional tension," I watched his face twist with something deeper than rage, the kind of pain that comes from realizing you didn't know the person you married at all. He raised his hand, Not to strike, not to gesture, just to point, slow and precise, toward the hallway where the door to Emily's room still hung open. And he said, "You were in her room, in her robe." And that was it. That was the moment that broke whatever was still intact between us. Because even though it wasn't her robe, even though I had worn it long before Emily ever existed, I couldn't deny how it looked, how I looked, how Tyler had looked behind me. Too close, too bare, too familiar. And then Tyler came down the stairs, casually, slowly, a clean t-shirt now covering his chest, phone in his hand, not smiling but not hiding either. And the moment Daniel saw him, something inside him snapped. Not violently, but with terrifying clarity. And he lunged, not like a man looking for a fight, but like a father protecting the last shred of dignity his daughter had left. Before he could reach him, Emily stepped between them, fast and firm, her arm across Daniel's chest, her voice calm but final when she said, "He's not worth it." And Daniel froze mid-motion, breathing hard, eyes locked on Tyler, who didn't flinch, didn't look down, didn't offer anything close to remorse. What happened next didn't feel real. Daniel turned slowly, walked into the kitchen, picked up my phone from the table where I had left it face down earlier, unlocked it with a swipe, and scrolled with practiced certainty until he found what he was looking for, and when he turned the screen toward me, his voice cracked, not from anger, but disbelief, as he read the message out loud, "You taste better than her." And my knees buckled slightly, because I had forgotten it existed, had forgotten we had stopped hiding even in writing. The silence that followed his words felt deeper than any scream could have been, because it wasn't just about what had been read aloud. It was about everything it confirmed without needing further explanation. And as I stood there barefoot on the kitchen tile with the hem of my robe brushing my ankles and my face flushed not with shame, but with something harder to name, I couldn't even summon the instinct to defend myself. Because what do you say when every corner of the room already holds proof of what you've done? When the man you betrayed is holding your own phone in his hand and staring at you like you're a stranger he wouldn't bother crossing the street to avoid. Emily didn't look up, didn't say anything, just picked up her bag from the floor without meeting my eyes, her shoulders tense and her expression so unreadably blank that I couldn't tell whether she was holding back tears or rage or both. And when Daniel turned away from me and reached for the folder tucked under his arm, I thought for a second he might hand me another message, another photo, another damning scrap of truth. But instead, he dropped a thin stack of documents onto the table with a weight that felt louder than any accusation, and his voice was low, tight, precise when he said, "Our lawyers are already in the loop," as if everything had already moved past me, as if I was no longer part of the equation at all. I didn't ask what kind of documents they were because I already knew, and the way the papers slid slightly across the table when he turned toward the door felt like a closing, a clean severing. And as he placed his hand gently on Emily's back to guide her out without a single backward glance, I realized that whatever I had done had stopped being a story or a mistake or a phase. It had become a fact, something permanent and irreversible, and filed away under my name in the way a broken bone doesn't fully heal, just hardens wrong. The sound of the front door closing was softer than I expected, almost careful, and for a second I stood perfectly still, as if movement would confirm the reality I hadn't wanted to face. And then I walked back into the kitchen, picked up the phone that had been left on the counter like evidence abandoned at a crime scene, and turned it face down again, as if that could erase the screen Daniel had read from, the message Tyler had written without hesitation, the part of myself I had given away with both hands and no backup plan. I don't remember how long I stood there after they left, or whether I moved immediately or simply drifted, but the next thing I knew, I was sitting at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped tightly around a lukewarm mug of coffee I didn't remember pouring, my fingers clenched, not around the warmth, but the memory of everything that had unraveled in the past hour. The suitcase by the door, Emily's eyes wide with disbelief, Daniel's voice steady with fury, the taste of guilt sharper than anything Tyler had ever whispered in my ear. The kitchen felt enormous in its emptiness, every drawer and cabinet suddenly too far from reach, the hum of the refrigerator louder than it had ever been, and the smell of something faint and floral rising from the hallway where Emily had left her travel-size shampoo behind felt like the cruelest kind of echo. And I sat there unmoving, barely blinking, my shoulders drawn in, the robe still loosely tied, my breath shallow and my spine stiff, as if posture could still protect me from the magnitude of what had just happened. Behind me, the hallway stretched, toward the bedrooms with a stillness that no longer invited silence but seemed to punish it. And the door to Emily's room was still ajar, still holding the imprint of everything that had been discovered there. And though no one was left to walk through it now, I couldn't look away from it, couldn't will myself to close it because, in its half-open state, it held the only mirror I hadn't yet shattered, the truth of what I had let happen and the echo of the girl who used to live there, whose clothes still hung in the closet I had walked past a dozen times pretending not to hear the sound of betrayal growing louder each night. I got up eventually, not with energy, but with the heaviness of someone who has nothing left to sit with, and I walked slowly toward that room, my hand brushing against the wall for balance, and when I reached the threshold, I stood there for a long time, staring not at the bed or the dresser or the walls that still held posters she had taped up in high school, but at the mirror above the desk, the one angled just enough to catch me where I stood. I looked like someone I didn't recognize. My hair was pulled back too loosely, strands curling around my face like they didn't belong to me anymore, and my skin looked pale and unfamiliar in the dim light, my eyes sunken with something deeper than exhaustion. And the robe that had once felt like a comfort now hung like a costume from a scene I hadn't meant to audition for, and I stood there, studying my own face, trying to find the woman who had said she wouldn't cross certain lines, who had believed she was still in control, and the longer I looked, the more certain I became that she wasn't coming back. I reached for the mirror, not to clean it or adjust it or even touch my own reflection, but to take it down, to remove it from the room entirely, because I couldn't stand the idea of facing myself in it again, not tomorrow, not ever. And as I slid it from its place on the wall and carried it out into the hallway, the house felt quieter than it ever had before. The kind of quiet that doesn't wait for footsteps or voices, but settles in like fog, heavy and permanent, and full of things you can no longer explain away. I set the mirror down behind the laundry room door, face toward the wall, not broken, not damaged, just hidden. And when I walked back through the kitchen one last time, I didn't turn on any lights, didn't wash my hands, didn't pick up my phone. I just sat back down at the table, facing the window, where the outside world moved on without me. A month passed, not like a page turning or a door closing, but like dust collecting slowly on surfaces I'd stopped touching, like air thickening in rooms where no one spoke anymore. And every morning, I woke not because I wanted to, but because the light that filtered in through the cracks of the curtains made it impossible to keep pretending that sleep could last forever. And in those early hours, when the sound of traffic outside the house was too soft to distract and too steady to ignore, I would lie still under the blanket, fully dressed from the night before, wondering if anyone would notice if I simply stayed that way, motionless, untouched, unseen. The house, once full of footsteps and overlapping conversations and the occasional slammed door followed by reluctant apologies, now stood hollow in every sense of the word, not just empty of people but of noise, of presence, of urgency, and each creak of the floorboards sounded exaggerated, artificial, like the walls were mimicking life out of memory rather than sound, and the silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt suspicious, like it was waiting for me to try and fill it with something real and then judge me when I couldn't. No one called anymore, not even the telemarketers who used to ask for Mr. or Mrs. McLean with hopeful enthusiasm, and the only thing the mailbox delivered were envelopes printed with law firm letterheads or thin, impersonal documents reminding me of payments due. Signatures required, agreements breached, and every time I walked the long stretch of cracked sidewalk to the mailbox and opened the lid, I found nothing resembling human contact, only numbers and clauses and warnings, and once a yellow slip saying a package had been returned to sender. The neighbors stopped waving. I noticed it the first week, when Mrs. Harrell next door pretended to be adjusting the straps of her gardening gloves rather than meet my eyes as I passed her gate. And it happened again with the couple across the street, who once invited us to their anniversary barbecue and now seemed to time their grocery bags to their trunk only when my blinds were closed, and I began taking the trash out at odd hours to avoid the sting of recognition, because the worst part wasn't that they judged me, it was that they pitied me in a way too polite to correct. The office sent a message, not through a call, not with a conversation, but with a cold, formal email stating that my position was being temporarily suspended pending internal review due to reputational complications. And though they padded the statement with words like value and contribution and process, I understood exactly what it meant, especially when my work login stopped functioning the next day, and no one from the team reached out to check on me or offer the usual useless condolences they'd pass around for broken wrists or sick children. Tyler was gone. He didn't say goodbye, didn't knock on my door, didn't leave a note on the fridge or a t-shirt on the floor of Emily's room. He simply disappeared, as if the part of him that had been so certain, so immovable, had evaporated the moment the confrontation ended and the weight of consequence began. But 2 weeks after he left, an envelope arrived, postmarked 2 towns over, the handwriting unmistakably his, the letter short, 3 lines at most, the ink thick where he had pressed too hard. And though I had promised myself I wouldn't open anything with his name on it, I did. And the sentence that stayed with me long after the paper turned to ash in the sink was this: "You were never just her mother to me." I didn't cry, I didn't shout or slam anything or reread the words, because the truth was I didn't need the letter to remember what had been said, what had been done, what couldn't be undone. And as the paper curled and darkened under The flame of the burner. I felt nothing. No release, no clarity, no regret sharp enough to give a name to. Only the dull, familiar numbness that had followed me from room to room like a smell I couldn't scrub out of the walls. I tried calling Emily once a week, never from the same number, never at the same time, thinking maybe the variation would trick her into answering by accident, but she never picked up, not once. And I sent voicemails, not long ones, not begging or emotional or dramatic, just short fragments like, hope classes are going okay, or let me know if you need anything, or I'm sorry if I can't fix what I broke. And each time I finished recording, I watched the little icon disappear into the void and wondered whether she played them on mute just to know I was still trying, or deleted them without listening. Daniel only called once more, not to speak, but to inform, to tell me the papers were ready, that the buyer had been found, that the offer was clean, and the process would be fast if I didn't fight it. And though I said I needed time to think, I knew I didn't have any right to delay it anymore, because the house was no longer a home but a holding cell, and the walls that had once kept in love and laughter now held only memory and dread. So, I signed the documents and slid them back into the prepaid envelope and placed them in the outgoing box without ceremony, without hesitation, without hope. The day the documents were finalized and the final notice confirmed the sale had gone through, I walked from room to room not to say goodbye, not to reminisce or feel anything resembling closure, but to check one last time whether I had left anything behind, whether there was any piece of me worth taking into the next version of whatever was supposed to come after this. And as I passed the doorways, the closets, the bare dresser tops that once held candles and jewelry trays and framed pictures now packed away or discarded, I felt not sadness or relief, but something flatter, like walking through a museum where the exhibits had already been removed and the labels peeled off the walls. The bedroom still smelled faintly of the lavender linen spray I used when I believed in nightly routines. And though I hadn't touched the sheets in weeks, I smoothed them out mechanically, as if preparing the bed for a guest who'd never arrive. And I caught a glimpse of myself in the wardrobe mirror as I turned toward the hallway. The curve of my spine under the sweater I hadn't taken off in 3 days, the tilt of my head as if even my posture had grown apologetic, and I looked away quickly, not out of vanity or shame, but because the reflection no longer felt like it belonged to someone with agency, only to someone who had witnessed too much and done too little to stop it. I made my way down the hall and paused outside Emily's door, which still bore the faint outline of her name in the sticker letters she'd peeled off in middle school, leaving a shadow of glue and a memory of ownership. And when I turned the knob and stepped inside, I was hit by a scent so specific and intimate it nearly knocked me back. The dusty combination of perfume samples, old textbooks, and fabric softener that clung to her room like it hadn't realized she was gone. And for a moment I stood there in the middle of the floor, breathing carefully, afraid that even exhaling too hard might erase the last trace of her from the air. The bed was still made the way she always made it, with the sheet folded over the blanket and the corners tucked sharp, and I sat down slowly, the mattress giving. Beneath me, like it had once done under the weight of her teenage body sprawled with notebooks and headphones, and as I ran my hand along the pillowcase, tracing the seam like it held the outline of a conversation we never finished, I felt the first real crack in my chest since they walked out that morning, not a scream or a sob or a collapse, but a slow, unbearable ache that began behind my ribs and worked its way upward until it reached the hollow space where my voice used to be. I lay down fully dressed, shoes still on, body curled into her comforter, hands clenched together beneath my chin. Like prayer had returned in some accidental form, and I stared at the ceiling. The same ceiling I used to paint with glow-in-the-dark stars when she was little. The same ceiling I had once taped birthday balloons to. And I whispered, not because I thought anyone could hear me, not because I expected forgiveness, but because some part of me needed to speak it aloud, even if only the walls were listening. I'm sorry, I said, barely louder than breath, and then again, I'm sorry. And though I don't know how long I repeated it, I know that eventually it no longer sounded like a word, only a sound my body made when it couldn't hold the weight anymore. The room darkened as the sun moved behind the trees outside, casting slow shadows across the carpet, and I didn't turn on the light, didn't check the time, didn't move, except to pull the blanket tighter around my shoulders when a draft from the open window brushed across the back of my neck like a goodbye I hadn't earned, and I stayed there long after the sounds outside faded, long after the streetlights came on and the day turned fully to night, my breath the only thing reminding me that time hadn't stopped completely. Eventually, I stood, the chair at the table slightly pulled out as if someone had only just left, and I stood there in the dim glow of the overhead light that flickered once before staying on, and I looked at the sink, the stove, the back door locked from the inside, and I saw the outline of myself reflected faintly in the window glass, not in color or detail, just in shape, in suggestion, and I realized then that I had become exactly what I feared most, And with the room perfectly still around me, with no footsteps above, no voices behind walls, no phone calls waiting to be answered, I pulled the curtains tighter, sat in the chair with my hands folded in my lap, and let the silence take the rest of me.